What's going on, Bulls fans? Welcome to another episode of Chicago Bulls Central, your number one spot for everything Chicago Bulls related. On today's episode, Bleacher Report recently did a redraft of the 2017 draft in which the Bulls took Lauri Markkenen. So we're going to talk about that. Who do they have the Bulls selecting now in the redraft? And then we're going to revisit the Lauri Markkenen trade that we're almost at the year anniversary of and the impact of that and what that meant and kind of signaled for the new Bulls regime. We'll get into all that and more right after this.
You are now tuned in to Chicago Bulls Central, your number one place for all Chicago Bulls news and content.
All right, Bulls fans. So, as I said in the opening, Bleacher Report recently did a redraft of the 2017 draft. Now, this draft has produced only 4 All-Stars over the course of this draft. Only one player to be on an All-NBA team, and that is Jason Tatum. So out of this draft, the 4 All-Stars so far have been Jason Tatum, Donovan Mitchell, Bam Adebayo, and Jarrett Allen. Other than that, no other All-Stars generated from this, even though there are some really solid players in this draft as well. There have been some big misses as well. Markelle Fultz, who the start of his career was kind of weird. He came back out of it pretty well. We drafted Lauri Markkenen in this draft. Frank Ntilikina, who ended up turning into nothing for the Knicks, and they thought he was going to turn into something. Some other misses. I wouldn't say Malik Monk is a miss. Let me not say that. Dennis Smith Jr., who had an initial really good rookie season, kind of fell off a cliff there. Justin Patton, where's he at now? DJ Wilson, TJ Liff, John Collins, who did turn into something. Harry Giles, Gile, I can't remember how you pronounce his name. But with that being said, who seemed like he was promising but had some injury concerns. But some of the gems in this draft, OG Anunoby, who was drafted 23rd overall in this draft. I already mentioned Jarrett Allen, who he was drafted 22nd, but turning into an All-Star in this draft as well. Some overall Kyle Kuzma, who turned into a pretty solid player as well. Like, there were some players that were drafted later in this draft. So it makes a redraft interesting. Now, in the redraft, one of the things that the Bleacher Report does have Jason Tatum now going first, who was originally picked 3rd. Bam Adebayo going 2nd, who was originally picked 14th. Donovan Mitchell, originally picked 13th, going 3rd in this redraft. Jarrett Allen, who was picked 22nd, going number 4 overall. John Collins, who was originally picked 19th, him going number 5. De'Aaron Fox going number 6, where he was originally picked 5th. And Lonzo Ball coming in at number 7. He was originally picked number 2nd overall, but coming in at number 7 to be drafted by the Chicago Bulls. To round out the top 10, OG Anunoby in the redraft going number 8, originally 23rd. Derek White, originally 29th, going 9th overall. And then Luke Kennard, who was originally picked 12th, going 10th overall. So that's just kind of looking at some of the redrafts. They do have Lauri Markkenen going number 11 overall, whereas he was drafted 7th, which would have sent him to the Charlotte Hornets. But the interesting thing in this draft is Lonzo Ball coming to the Chicago Bulls at number 7. Now, how would this have changed the history of the Chicago Bulls? One would say, hey, well, that means that Lonzo was always destined to be a Chicago Bull. And that could very well be true, right? They could have they had their backcourt locked in. Keep in mind, this is the same time that they drafted Lauri Markkenen, so that means he came over in the same trade as Zach LaVine, which means that they would have brought in Lonzo Ball and Zach LaVine in the same year to become a Chicago Bull. Now, Chris Dunn would have still been part of that trade. So how would that have changed for the Chicago Bulls? Would the Bulls still have who they were very high on, Chris Dunn, at that time? Keep in mind, almost the year before, they would have traded Chris Dunn traded Jimmy Butler for Chris Dunn straight up is something that they were contemplating. And as I've always said, Zach LaVine was not looked at as being a main piece in that trade. It was really Lauri and Chris Dunn, and Zach LaVine, who was coming off an injury while a promising piece, wasn't one of the key pieces that I think the Bulls front office at that time would have thought that as of now, Zach LaVine is the one who signs the largest contract in Chicago Bulls history in this offseason. Now, so what does that mean for the Chicago Bulls? Like I said, one would think that, the Bulls would have had their backcourt, but like I said, working in the Chris Dunn aspect of it, they probably would have still tried to start Chris Dunn. Lonzo maybe would have had to work himself into the starting lineup. But let's take all that away, right? The Chris Dunn of it all, let's just throw that to the side because we know Chris Dunn ended up turning into nothing. The biggest question that I do have, considering the injury concerns for Lonzo Ball, especially in his first 2 seasons. Would the Bulls have held on to Lonzo Ball? Keep in mind, higher on Chris Dunn, things like that. Would they have, and we're just saying for the nature of this, if they would have drafted Lonzo, because of how high they were in Chris Dunn, they probably would not have drafted another point guard. But if they did, everything stayed the same, but they drafted Lonzo instead of Lauri Markkenen. Lonzo, let's say everything stays the same. He does have that injury concerns, things like that. Do they end up moving off from Lonzo Ball? Keep in mind, Pax was still in power. They would have still been in power up until 2020. So that still would have been 3 years of having Lonzo Ball before AK and Eversley would have come in. Would Pax have moved on from Lonzo Ball? That is the biggest question. I'm of two minds because, as we know with Pax, they did hold on to players a little bit longer sometimes. They were slower to move away from players unless they, like with the Bobby Portis thing, unless they weren't going to accept an extension, things like that. Would they have kept on, or would they have used Lonzo as a trade chip considering the hype around Lonzo Ball at that time? Now, the redraft is just an interesting thing because you have to go through so many different things to kind of make this redraft work because, again, in no world in 2017 would Donovan Mitchell have gone that high. It's only with hindsight that we say that. But if Lonzo Ball would have become a Chicago Bull, like I said, the biggest question to me that I'm presenting there is, do they hold on to him with his injury concerns? Or do they move on from him? Do they use him as a trade chip? Does he get a chance to develop chemistry with Zach LaVine and them come up as this dynamic backcourt duo? It does affect. It would, in a lot of ways, change a lot of things as a light dies in the back, but it would change a lot of things in Chicago Bulls history. They then probably don't draft Kobe White if Lonzo Ball does shine for them later on, which they do some other things down the stretch there. It's just one of those things. Like I don't know. Pax is such an interesting front office. Like they do things that they did things that just made no sense. They didn't really have foresight in the way that they were building the team. And I think everything happens for a reason, right? Lonzo coming into the Chicago Bulls system at that time, I don't think Lonzo would be a Chicago Bull right now. I just don't think he would. And not because of his own doing, not just because of the injury. I just don't think Pax at that point, considering how high they were and done and other things like that, that they would have held on to Lonzo with injury concerns. Now, one would say that, hey, on the flip side of that, let me offer both sides of that. No, maybe they will keep Lonzo. They'll let him and Zach LaVine develop at this point now at this time. Maybe Lonzo Ball doesn't even have those injury concerns, right? Nature of what I'm talking about, I am saying that he still has the injury concerns because it is still something, for example, we dealt with this season. But maybe they do. Maybe they see, hey, this Lonzo kid is better defensively than Chris Dunn. He can work on a shot. Again, the way that the Bulls developed, like, does Lonzo even change the shot as much? I don't know. And then now we have a front court as a piece that is a young front court that's developing over the next 3 years together. And maybe we're better off at that point. I don't really know. It's just interesting to live in that ulterior world thing. Let me know down below, how do you think things would change if the Bulls did end up with Lonzo Ball in that 2017 redraft? Now, on the flip side of that, one of the things I want to talk about is revisiting the Lauri Markkenen trade. So Lauri Markkenen was traded on August 28th. So we're 5 days away from the 1 year anniversary of the Lauri Markkenen trade. But let's go ahead, since it came up in this redraft, and revisit that trade now. So Lauri Markkenen, the trade that went down is that we sent Lauri to Cleveland in a 3-team trade with the Portland Trail Blazers. In that 3-team trade, Cleveland also traded Larry Nance Jr. to Portland and a protected 2023 second-round pick to the Chicago Bulls. And then the Bulls, we got Derrick Jones Jr. and a first-round pick from Portland that we still hasn't conveyed yet. We'll see what happens with that. It was lottery protected, continues to be protected. So revisiting this trade and looking at it, and the biggest thing with this, and I don't mean to drum up any PTSD, right? But this was kind of the first sign of the Chicago Bulls avoiding the luxury tax, because they could have. Portland almost didn't need to be involved in this trade at all. This trade could have very well worked out to the point where the Bulls just took in Larry Nance's contract, which was a position of need, especially looking at hindsight. Now Patrick Williams went down. How different does this Bulls team look if we have Larry Nance Jr. here instead of Derrick Jones Jr.? Now, one could also say if we did not do the trade the way that we did, we wouldn't have Portland's upcoming first-round pick in next year's draft, which very well may convey, because I think Portland is going to make the playoffs, and I do think we're gonna get that pick next season. But if that doesn't happen, right? If the Bulls weren't trying to avoid the luxury tax, we would have Larry Nance Jr. We wouldn't have Portland's first round pick. We would have a future 2023 second round pick from Denver in that case, but we wouldn't have the first round pick. So it really, when you're looking at reevaluating that trade, you're looking at it saying, is the future asset in the first round pick from Portland that again could convey this season, is that greater than having Larry Nance Jr. last season for the Chicago Bulls? And then how does that change this past offseason for the Bulls? Like, do they still need to go after Andre Drummond? Do they what changes with the Bulls team then? It's a lot of questions that could be asked there, right? A lot of questions that could be asked. Ultimately, I do think, especially considering Derrick Jones Jr. he didn't have the best season. He had a stretch there, but he didn't have the best season with the Chicago Bulls. He's not a better player than Larry Nance Jr. They still tried the way that they used Derrick Jones Jr. last season. If you keep everything the same and you lose Larry Nance in that position instead of Derrick Jones Jr., you're still giving up some size, but not as much. You have a player that's more naturally a 4 and can play a small ball 5. He still offers some ability to stretch the floor, things like that. Is he the shot blocker that Derrick Jones Jr. has shown that he can be at stretches? There's some questions to be asked there. But I'm looking at that and saying, man, I still would have rather the Chicago Bulls had Larry Nance Jr. instead of Derrick Jones Jr. Even with that first round pick. Now, if the Bulls turn around and do something with that first round pick, that's different, right? But are they going to? Are they going to is the question. We'll see if it conveys. There are some doubts that if it does convey, especially with Portland being in the West, does that pick actually convey? And I understand those questions there. But looking at the seasons of Larry Nance Jr. and Derrick Jones Jr., let's just get into that some, right? And again, different teams, different ways of playing, things could be different. Larry Nance Jr. last season played in 46 overall games between Portland and New Orleans. He started 11 of those games, and his overall season averages are 7 points, 5.4 rebounds, and 1.8 assists with a PER, player efficiency rating, of 14.37, which is really good for a primarily bench player. Derrick Jones Jr. on the flip side of that gave us 5.6 points per game, 3.3 rebounds per game, 0.6 assists, and a PER of 12.98, so right under 13. Derrick Jones Jr. played in 51 games for the Chicago Bulls and started 8 games. So the question remains there. You get more games with Derrick Jones Jr., but again, Larry Nance Jr. is just a better player when he's out there on the court. And again, being a true position of need, even though they're about the same size, right? Derrick Jones Jr. is 6'6", 210 pounds. Larry Nance Jr. is 6'7", 245 pounds. That added weight is considerable. Now, Larry Nance Jr. is also older. He's 29 years old. He has a much different contract. But again, looking back at that trade, I still say I would almost rather have Larry Nance Jr. The only thing is that kicker is what the Bulls end up doing with that first round pick that they have this season is going to be the question there. Let me know what you guys think about that one down below. But before we go, let's talk about the flip of Lauri Markkenen. Let's talk about the fact that we traded Lauri Markkenen. Lauri Markkenen, who's played and started all 61 games that he played last season for the Cleveland Cavaliers, had averages of 14.8 points per game, 5.7 rebounds, 1.3 assists, and a PER of 14.76. Compare that to his last season with the Chicago Bulls, where he averaged 13.6 points per game, 5.3 rebounds per game, 0.9 assists per game, 0.3 blocks. And then he had an efficiency rating in his last season for the Chicago Bulls of 15.25. Now, I was very vocal in last offseason saying that if the Bulls could have worked it out and smoothed out that relationship, I would have loved to see Lauri Markkenen stay on this team, right? Play that bench role, and come in and see what he could have done. Considering Lauri Markkenen then turned around and basically started at the 3 for the Cleveland Cavaliers, to even be able, if you're flexing him and Patrick Williams and playing him some at the 3, Patrick Williams some at the 3. Again, we missed Patrick Williams for most of last season. And some Bulls fans, even on this channel as recently, have said that they wish that the Bulls would have been able to keep Lauri Markkenen. Now, I still believe in Lauri's overall role on the team. Like him being a stretch big who can put the ball on the floor, do some things. I still think Lauri can turn into a decent player in the NBA. He's far from the finisher days, right? That's long and gone. Lauri Markkenen is no longer the finisher. He's just a solid piece on a team. And, even in doing this redraft and looking at it and reevaluating that trade, like the trade had to go down. Lauri needed to change the scenery. The Bulls have all but moved on from him. Lauri Markkenen is definitely a casualty of having Jim Boylen as the head coach for so long, and Gar Pax just not building a very good team around them. And I know Lauri did play one season under Billy Donovan, but still, like that taste in the mouth from that era, I think did affect Lauri Markkenen and his development. Like, keep in mind, I've said this before too, like the Bulls just didn't do a good job at developing players over that stretch of time either. Jim Boylen was just not that guy. Everything does not work out. And yeah, that's why I even had the conversation the way I did about Lonzo Ball. Like, does he develop into the player he is now if he's under Jim Boylen for that amount of time? If he comes into this team, and again, he had turmoil other places, but coming to this team that just didn't know their heads from their asses in the front office for so long. And I apologize I've been trying my best not to curse as much, but hey, listen, I said ass. It's not that bad. That's the biggest question. Like, reevaluating this trade, I don't care that the Bulls didn't keep Lauri Markkenen. Like, even though I like to see Lauri Markkenen play at times, but I am appreciative that he's not on my team. As you see, even, he didn't really have a markedly better season with the Chicago Bulls. His efficiency actually dropped some. So, it kind of is what it is there. But it's just an interesting conversation to have at times to just do the what ifs. Like, right, if we're Marvel, it's what if for basketball. And I just look at that and say, hey, listen, yeah, the Bulls, while that I do think this trade was the first sign, and this is why we shouldn't be as surprised that they avoided the luxury tax again this season. This was the Bulls' first time of this new front office really doing some cost-cutting measures in a trade that could have been a position of need for the Chicago Bulls. Larry Nance is just the better. They could have had the better player in there, but they went with the player that's contract was a little bit less, and that helped them avoid the luxury tax. So, like I said, it's just kind of in hindsight, it's kind of interesting to watch. Yeah, I mean, that's just where it kind of sits at. But let me know what you guys think about everything down below. Again, taking less long-term money with Larry Nance Jr. It's just, the thing that bothers me about it, right, is that you went with Derrick Jones Jr. instead of Larry Nance Jr. because of the lack of long-term money, which is fine, right? Let's be clear here. That's fine if that's what you want to do. And Larry Nance Jr. and Derrick Jones Jr. contracts just in last season really weren't that much difference between each other. So Derrick Jones Jr. last season making $9.6 million. Larry Nance Jr., guess what? No, he made $9.7 million with Derrick Jones Jr. Larry Nance Jr. in the first year in what would have been a deal with the Chicago Bulls, $9.6 million. So, it's just interesting to break down, especially when you get into saving. But now again, less long-term money. Larry Nance Jr. was annually $11 million, and I think that's a descending contract. So yeah, last year, Larry Nance Jr. made $10 million. So they saved about 10.6. So the Bulls saved about $1 million in salary cap last season. The difference is that Larry Nance Jr. would not have been an unrestricted free agent at the end of the season like Derrick Jones Jr. was. But again, the Bulls didn't do anything with that cap flexibility. That's the difference, right? Because Andre Drummond signed for the minimum, they still would have been able to sign Andre Drummond. Still would have been able to sign him. So with that being said, like, looking at it, this was one of the big first steps in this team making a long-term cap savings, but maybe it hurting the team because you could have had a better player that could have played that position a little bit better. But all right, I'm belaboring the point. Let me know what you guys think about it down below. Do you reevaluating this trade? Do you still think the Bulls made the right decision? Do you wish they would have went after Larry Nance Jr.? Is the first round pick from Portland enough to overtake that? And then lastly, let me know down below, what's your overall thoughts now that we've been removed from it for a year? in Lauri's stretch with the Chicago Bulls? Let me know all that down below. Thank you for being the best part of Chicago Bulls Central. You can send us any feedback, questions, comments, concerns, bullcentralpod@gmail.com. Lastly, if you want to leave a text and or voicemail, the number to do so, 773-270-2799. We are the number one spot for everything Chicago Bulls related. You can follow the show at Bulls Central Pod. But that's it. Like I like to end every episode on, go Bulls, love you guys. Peace, y'all. I fucked up that ending, but nonetheless, peace, y'all.
This has been a presentation of the Break Media.